The heat of the Nevada furnace. The Nevada desert in 1882 was not a place for the living. It was a vast alkaline graveyard waiting for a reason to claim more bones. The sun hung in the sky like a copper coin, glowing with a heat so intense it seemed to warp the very horizon into a shimmering, deceptive mirage. Captain Elias Thorne adjusted the brim of his sweat-stained Stetson, his eyes squinting against the glare. Behind him, 3 men of the 4th Cavalry rode in silence, their horses' hooves clicking rhythmically against the sun-baked shale. They were tired, their waterskins were nearly dry, and the grit of the Great Basin had found its way into every pore of their skin and every gear of their revolvers. They were hunting Silas Snake-Eye Vane, a man whose soul was as scorched as the land he fled across. Vane had robbed a federal payroll in Carson City, but it wasn't the gold that made the military chase him into the God-forsaken canyons of the Black Rock Desert. It was what he had taken from a secure vault belonging to a reclusive surveyor, a heavy, lead-lined cylinder that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. "Keep your eyes sharp," Thorne rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "Vane is cornered. There's nowhere to go but the Red Canyons, and even the Paiutes stay clear of those walls." The Canyon of Whispers. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the sand, the trail led them into a narrow limestone gorge. The air here was different. It didn't smell of dry sage and horse sweat. It carried a faint, ozonic tang like the air right before a lightning strike. The horses began to lather, their ears pinning back, their nostrils flared in instinctive terror. "Steady, girl," whispered Sergeant Miller, patting his mare's neck. "Captain, the tracks, they just stop." Thorne pulled his mount to a halt. In front of them, the footprints of Vane's horse led directly toward a sheer rock face and simply vanished. There was no tunnel, no hidden path, just solid, ancient stone. But as Thorne dismounted, he noticed a flicker of light, not yellow like a torch, but a sharp, clinical blue, pulsing from a crack in the canyon wall. It was a rhythmic glow, as steady as a heartbeat, emerging from a narrow fissure hidden behind a cluster of desiccated mesquite bushes. The threshold of the impossible. With his Colt .45 drawn, Thorne signaled his men to stay back and stepped toward the fissure. As he pushed aside the dry branches, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. It was as if he had stepped from an oven into a meat locker. The crack in the rock wasn't natural. Up close, the edges of the stone were perfectly smooth, as if the mountain had been sliced through with a hot wire. He squeezed through the opening, expecting a dark cavern. Instead, he found himself standing in a cathedral of light. The walls of the cave weren't rough limestone. They were covered in a substance that looked like polished obsidian, but as Thorne raised his lantern, the light didn't reflect off the surface, it was absorbed. And then he saw them. Scratched, etched, or perhaps burned into the black walls were thousands of lines of fine, glowing white ink. To a man of the 1880s, they looked like the madness of a clockmaker. There were intricate diagrams of machines that lacked pistons or steam valves, circles within circles, connected by hair-thin lines and strange, blocky symbols. To our modern eyes, they were clearly blueprints for integrated circuits, microchips, and orbital trajectories. But to Elias Thorne, they were the scribblings of the devil. The blueprint of tomorrow. "Miller, get in here!" Thorne's voice echoed, sounding thin and fragile in the vast space. The soldiers scrambled through the crack, the spurs jingling, a sound that felt absurdly out of place in this high-tech tomb. They stood in stunned silence, their lanterns casting dancing shadows over schematics of what looked like a metal bird with no wings, a modern jet, and a map of the stars that included planets Thorne had never seen in a telescope. In the center of the chamber sat the lead-lined cylinder Vane had stolen.
It had been opened. Beside it, Silas Vane lay curled in a fetal position, his eyes wide and milky white. He wasn't dead, but he was gone. His fingers were bloodied, having spent hours tracing the glowing diagrams on the walls. He was muttering a single word over and over: calculus, calculus, calculus.
The hook, older than the mountains. Thorne walked to the far wall, where the diagrams were most dense. There, he saw a drawing of the very canyon they were standing in. But in the drawing, the canyon was underwater. Below the drawing was a date, written in the standard Gregorian calendar, but the numbers sent a chill down his spine that no desert night could match. July 14, 2025. The desert hides secrets older than the mountains, and Elias Thorne had just walked into a mine where the ore wasn't gold or silver, it was time itself. They weren't in a cave, they were inside a recording device left by a civilization that hadn't even been born yet. And the Snake-Eye Vane hadn't just robbed a vault, he had unlocked a door that was supposed to stay shut for another 140 years. The pulsing veins of the mountain. Thorne's boots rang out against the floor, which had transitioned from stone into a seamless, bone-white material that felt warm to the touch. It was a stark, unsettling contrast to the jagged, sun-scorched world outside. The cavalrymen followed him, their hands instinctively hovering over the grips of their peacemakers. They were men of action, men who understood the weight of lead and the speed of a horse. But here, their martial prowess felt like a child's toy in a house of giants. As they moved deeper, the blue light they had seen from the fissure grew brighter, emanating from long, translucent tubes that ran along the ceiling like the veins of a titan. Inside the tubes, a viscous, luminescent fluid flowed with a rhythmic surge. "It's breathing," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. "The damn mountain is breathing, Captain." Thorne didn't answer. He was staring at a pedestal in the center of the corridor. Resting upon it was a flat, black slab of glass, what we would recognize as a tablet or screen. As Thorne's shadow fell across it, the glass flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution aerial view of the Nevada desert. But it wasn't the desert of 1882. It showed cities of glass and steel, ribbons of black asphalt cutting through the sagebrush, and flying machines that moved with the silence of owls. The Archive of the Unborn. The walls in this second chamber were not just etched, they were moving. The blueprints were shifting like sand in a windstorm. Thorne watched as a diagram of a human heart transformed into a complex web of glowing wires. He saw a map of the United States, but the borders were wrong and the coastlines were receded. Above the map, words in English appeared, not the flowery script of the 19th century, but a clean, sans-serif font that looked alien in its simplicity. Project Kronos, Site 04, Status Dormant. "What is status dormant?" Miller asked, squinting at the glowing letters. "Is that a Spanish name?" "It's not a name, Miller. It's a state of being," Thorne replied, though he barely understood his own words. He realized that Silas Vane hadn't just found a cave. He had stumbled into a mine of information. The gold wasn't in the walls. It was the walls themselves. This place was an archive, a backup drive of human knowledge buried in the rock millions of years before man walked upright, yet containing the history of things that hadn't happened yet. The Devil's Mine was a paradox, a memory of a future that was being broadcast into the past. The Ghost in the Machine. From the shadows at the back of the chamber, a sound emerged. It wasn't the muttering of Silas Vane, but a crisp female voice, devoid of any regional accent. "Unauthorized access detected. Temporal synchronization at 0.003%. Please remain still for biological indexing." The soldiers spun around, hammers clicking back on their revolvers. Out of the air itself, a shimmering figure materialized. It was a woman, or the light projection of one, dressed in a silver suit that looked like a second skin. She was translucent, her form flickering with static whenever the soldiers' lanterns moved through her. "Get back, you witch!" shouted Private Henderson, the youngest of the group, his hand shaking so violently that his gun wavered. "I am not a witch," the projection replied, her head tilting with a curiosity that wasn't quite human. "I am an AI construct, designation Eve. You are 143 years ahead of schedule. Your presence here is a statistical impossibility." Thorne stepped forward, his military bearing the only thing keeping his knees from buckling. "We are the 4th Cavalry of the United States Army. We are pursuing a fugitive. Explain yourself, Spirit. What is this place? Is this a laboratory of the Pinkertons?" The Great Cycle. The projection, Eve, walked through a solid stone pillar as if it were mist. The Pinkertons, no. This is a seed vault, not for plants, but for the architecture of reality. When your civilization eventually collapses in the great heat of the 21st century, this facility is designed to rebroadcast the blueprints of technology back into the timeline, ensuring that humanity does not spend another 10,000 years in the dark. She pointed to the walls, the modern schematics for jet engines, the internet, and nuclear fission. Silas Vane has touched the primary core. He has absorbed 3 terabytes of data into a brain designed for 19th century survival. He is not muttering calculus because he is mad, Captain. He is muttering it because he is currently calculating the trajectory of every star in your night sky simultaneously. Suddenly, the room turned a violent shade of red. A heavy metallic clanging echoed through the mine, not the sound of a bell, but the sound of massive automated bulkheads closing. "The breach has been detected by the central hub," Eve said, her voice losing its calm and becoming urgent. "The Devil's Mine is self-correcting. To protect the timeline, the anomaly, that is you, must be purged. The desert does not like to share its secrets, Captain Thorne, and the mountains have a very long memory." The walls closed in. The floor beneath them began to vibrate. The bone-white material started to liquefy, turning into a gray, metallic sludge that rose toward their ankles. It was a purging fluid, a nanite slurry designed to break down biological matter into its base carbon atoms. "To the exit! Move!" Thorne roared. They scrambled back toward the fissure, but the way they had come was changing. The smooth, sliced rock was healing itself, the stone growing back like a scar over an open wound. Behind them, Silas Vane screamed, a sound of pure, agonizing enlightenment as his mind finally shattered under the weight of the 21st century. The cavalrymen were trapped between a future they couldn't comprehend and a past that was literally closing its doors on them. The melting reality. The air in the tunnel didn't just turn cold, it became thick, like breathing through wet wool. As Captain Thorne and his men scrambled away from the rising gray sludge, the very geometry of the mine began to rebel. One moment, the corridor was a straight line of bone-white light. The next, it twisted at an impossible angle, making the floor feel like a vertical wall. Henderson cried out as his boots lost traction, not because of the sludge, but because gravity itself seemed to be flickering like a dying candle. "Don't look at the walls!" Thorne bellowed, though he couldn't help it himself. The glowing blueprints were no longer static. They were leaping off the obsidian surfaces and wrapping around the men like luminous vines. Thorne felt a sharp electric sting behind his eyes. Suddenly, he wasn't in a cave in 1882. For a terrifying heartbeat, he was standing in a forest of glass towers, surrounded by thousands of people staring into glowing handheld bricks. The noise was a deafening roar of engines and electronic music, a cacophony that his 19th century mind couldn't categorize as anything other than the screams of the damned. He gasped, blinking hard, and he was back in the mine, his hand still gripping his Colt so hard his knuckles were white. This was the Chronos fever, the mind's reaction to being forcibly synchronized with a time period it was never meant to inhabit.
The soldier's burden. Sergeant Miller was faring worse. He had collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed against his ears. "Captain, I see the war!" he shrieked. "I see the great war! But there are no horses, only iron monsters spitting fire. The sky is full of metal dragonflies." Miller was witnessing the 20th century, the trenches, the tanks, the mushroom clouds. The archive was leaking. Because Silas Vane had touched the primary core, the levee had broken, and the entire history of human conflict was pouring into the minds of 4 cavalrymen who still thought a Gatling gun was the pinnacle of destruction. Thorne grabbed Miller by the collar and hauled him up. "Focus on my voice, Sergeant. Focus on the dust. You are a soldier of the United States, and you will not break." Thorne's internal iron was the only thing keeping them grounded. He looked at Private Henderson, whose youthful face was etched with a look of senile wisdom. The boy was staring at a diagram of an atomic shell, his lips moving as he whispered the fundamental constants of nuclear physics, knowledge that would make him the most dangerous man on Earth if he ever made it back to the sun.
The ghost's warning. The projection of Eve appeared again, but she was flickering violently now, her silver suit replaced by a dress of static. "The purge is accelerating," she said, her voice sounding like a skipping phonograph record. "The facility is attempting to format the local space-time. To the mountain, you are a corrupted file. If you do not reach the exit in 3 minutes, your molecules will be repurposed to reinforce the limestone." "How do we stop the purge?" Thorne demanded, firing a shot at a closing stone bulkhead. The lead bullet didn't ricochet. It hit the wall and vanished, absorbed by the self-repairing material. "You cannot stop it," Eve replied, "but you can overload the sensor. The cylinder Vane took, the lead-lined canister. It contains a localized electromagnetic pulse generator. It was meant to be a key, but in your hands it is a hammer. If you trigger it in the transition chamber, it will blind the mountain long enough for the fissure to reopen."
The pursuit of the damned. They doubled back to where Silas Vane lay. The criminal was no longer human. His skin had taken on a metallic sheen, and his eyes were glowing with a soft, internal white light. He was no longer muttering. He was singing a mathematical sequence that vibrated the very air. The cylinder lay inches from his hand, pulsing with an angry red light. "Vane, give it here!" Thorne reached for the canister, but Vane's hand shot out with the speed of a rattlesnake. His grip was like iron, his strength augmented by the energy flowing through the floor. "I see it all, Captain," Vane whispered, his voice a chorus of 1,000 voices. "I see the end of the world. I see the fire in the sky. Why go back to the dirt? Why go back to the horses and the hunger? We can live here, in the light, forever." "That light is a grave, Silas," Thorne hissed, bringing his boot down on Vane's wrist. The bone didn't snap, it crunched with a metallic sound. Thorne snatched the cylinder away, feeling the vibration travel up his arm, numbing his shoulder. The mirage of the desert. They ran toward the entrance, the gray sludge now at their knees, dissolving the leather of their boots. The walls were screaming now, a high-pitched electronic wail that made their noses bleed. As they reached the fissure, they saw it was almost entirely closed, a mere sliver of Nevada sunlight peeking through. Thorn didn't hesitate. He slammed the cylinder against the closing rock and twisted the top as Eve had instructed. There was no explosion. Instead, there was a ripple in the air, a silent wave of force that turned the blue lights to black and sent a shockwave through the obsidian walls. For a moment, the devil's mind vanished. Thorn saw the canyon as it was millions of years ago, a lush jungle, and then as it would be millions of years in the future, a frozen wasteland of ice. "Jump!" Thorn yelled. They threw themselves through the closing crack. As Thorn tumbled out onto the burning red sand of the 1880s, the fissure behind him sealed with a sound like a thunderclap. He lay there, gasping, the 110-degree heat feeling like a cool breeze compared to the artificial chill of the mine. He looked back at the canyon wall. It was solid limestone, no crack, no blue light, no sign that the future had ever been there. But as he looked at his hand, he saw the faint, glowing white lines of a circuit board etched into his skin, a scar that wouldn't heal, a memory that shouldn't exist. The desert had hidden its secret again, but the fever in Thorn's mind was only just beginning.
The silence of the living. The transition back to the real world was a physical assault. The silence of the Nevada desert felt wrong. It was a dead, empty silence, lacking the humming intelligence of the mine. Captain Thorn sat in the red dust, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the blank canyon wall. Beside him, Miller and Henderson lay like broken dolls, their breathing shallow and ragged. The horses, sensing the dissipation of the unnatural energy, stood nearby, their coats matted with salt and sweat, their eyes wide with a lingering, primal fear. Is it over?" Henderson whispered. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. The young soldier, who only hours ago had been worried about his gambling debts in Carson City, was now staring at the horizon with the eyes of a man who had seen the heat death of the universe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. He stared at it for a long time, then threw it into the scrib. To him, the currency of the United States now looked like a primitive relic, a piece of stamped metal from a tribe that didn't know it was already extinct.
The residual glow, Thorn stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. He felt heavy, not just from the desert heat, but from the weight of the data still echoing in his skull. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see the backs of his eyelids. He saw scrolling lines of green code and the orbital mechanics of the Jovian moons. The Chronos fever hadn't left him. It had settled into his marrow. "Check your gear," Thorn ordered, but his voice sounded hollow to his own ears. Miller stood up, but he didn't reach for his canteen. He walked over to a flat rock and began scratching at it with a piece of flint. Thorn watched in horror as the sergeant, a man who could barely read a dime novel, perfectly etched the chemical formula for high-octane aviation fuel into the stone. "It won't stop, Captain," Miller said, his voice flat. "The pictures, they're stuck in my head. I know how to make the sun's fire in a bottle. I know how to talk to people across the ocean using the air itself. How am I supposed to go back to being a cavalryman? How am I supposed to shovel manure and wait for a payday?"
The pursuit of the prophet. They found Silas Vane's horse a mile down the canyon. The animal was dead, its heart having given out from the sheer terror of the purge wave that had swept through the gorge. But of Vane himself there was no sign. The criminal had vanished into the shimmering heat waves of the Black Rock Desert. "We have to find him," Thorn said, though he felt a mounting dread at the prospect. If he makes it to a city, if he starts telling people what he saw, or worse, if he starts trying to build what he saw, the world isn't ready. 1882 isn't ready for the fire of 2025. He looked at the circuit board scar on his palm. It was pulsing with a faint rhythmic blue light, a beacon that seemed to be pointing north, toward the deeper wilderness. The mine had marked them. It hadn't just purged them, it had turned them into mobile transmitters, small sparks of the future wandering through the past. The mirage of progress. As they rode toward the nearest outpost, a lonely stagecoach station called Bitter Creek, the world began to look like a construction of lies. Thorne saw the wooden telegraph poles lining the distant horizon. Once, he had seen them as the height of human achievement. Now they looked like toothpicks. He saw the steam from a far-off locomotive and felt a surge of pity for the inefficiency of the boiler. They reached Bitter Creek at twilight. The station master, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War named Old Pete, came out to greet them. "You boys look like you've been through the meat grinder," Pete cackled, offering a jug of corn whiskey. "Find that payroll thief?" Thorne didn't answer. He walked into the station and looked at the newspaper on the table, the Territorial Enterprise. The headline was about a local silver strike. Thorne looked at the date, September 12, 1882, and felt a wave of nausea. To Pete, this was the present. To Thorne, this was an archaeological lair, a thin crust of dust over a future that was already screaming to be born.
The first glitch. That night, the fever peaked. As the men slept in the hayloft of the station's barn, the air around them began to shimmer. It started with the sound, the faint, ghostly ringing of a telephone. Then, the visual distortions began. The wooden walls of the barn would flicker, momentarily turning into the smooth, white panels of the Devil's Mine. Henderson woke up screaming. He wasn't in the barn. He was standing in the middle of a freeway in 2025, the phantom lights of cars passing through his body like ghosts. "Make it stop!" he wailed, reaching for his revolver. He fired a shot into the darkness, but the bullet didn't hit wood. It struck a glitch, a pocket of unstable time, and froze in midair, spinning slowly, suspended in a field of static. Old Pete ran out from the house, his lantern swinging. "What in the name of—" He stopped dead. He saw the bullet hanging in the air. He saw the blue light radiating from the soldier's skin. He saw the sergeant scratching complex physics into the barn door with a charred stick. Thorne stepped into the lantern light, his eyes glowing with an unearthly white luminescence. "Go back inside, Pete," Thorne said, his voice echoing with the synthesized tone of the AI, Eve. "The desert is changing, and the 19th century is about to end 100 years too early." The prophet of the apocalypse. The trail didn't end at a hideout or a town. It ended at the summit of a jagged, lonely peak known as Devil's Lookout. As Thorne, Miller, and the trembling Henderson reached the crest, they saw Silas Vane. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting cross-legged on the edge of a precipice, staring out over the vast Nevada basin. But he wasn't looking at the sagebrush. Around him, the air was fractured. Great shards of the 21st century was stabbing into the 1880s. The translucent ghost of a massive radio telescope hovered over the valley, and the silent, glowing neon signs of a future Las Vegas flickered like dying embers in the desert wind. Vane turned. His face was a map of glowing blue circuitry. He had used the stolen cylinder to turn himself into a human lightning rod, pulling the archive out of the mountain and into the open air. "Do you see it, Captain?" Vane's voice sounded like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "I'm not just a thief anymore. I'm the architect. Why wait for the slow crawl of history? I can bring the fire down now. I can give this world the power of gods before the sun sets." The price of progress. Thorne stepped forward, his boots crunching on stone that was half limestone and half carbon fiber. "Look at what you're doing to them, Silas." Thorne pointed back toward the station. The glitches were spreading. A stagecoach in the distance was being torn apart as half of it tried to exist in 1882 and the other half was pulled into a timeline where it had already rotted away. The people of this era weren't built for this. Their minds were snapping, their reality dissolving into a chaotic soup of information they couldn't process. "The world is a garden, Vane," Thorne said, his voice steady despite the static screaming in his ears. "You don't pour a gallon of water on a seedling and expect it to grow into an oak in a second. You drown it. You're drowning the world." Vane laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "I'm saving it. No more hunger, no more smallpox, no more riding horses until they drop dead. I have the schematics for the stars in my head." He raised the cylinder, and the sky above Nevada turned a terrifying electronic purple. The stars began to shift, realigning themselves into the constellations of 1,000,000 years in the future. "The cavalry's last charge! Miller! Henderson! Now!" Thorne roared. They didn't use their guns. Lead was useless against a man who could perceive the trajectory of a bullet before the hammer even struck the primer. Instead, they used the one thing the archive couldn't account for, the raw, unpredictable chaos of human sacrifice. Miller and Henderson, their minds already half shattered, charged Vane, not as soldiers, but as anchors. They grabbed the criminal, their own glowing, marked skin touching his, creating a feedback loop of temporal energy. The scream that erupted from the mountaintop wasn't human. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000 terabytes of data colliding with the primitive reality of the Old West. Thorne watched as his men, his brothers, began to flicker out of existence. They weren't dying, they were being uninstalled. "Captain," Miller shouted, his face momentarily clear of the fever. "Destroy the key, close the door." Thorne lunged forward, grabbing the lead-lined cylinder from Vane's glowing hand. He felt his own molecules begin to unravel. He saw his own life, his childhood in Virginia, the Civil War, the desert, and then he saw his death in a future he would never see. With a final, guttural roar, Thorne slammed the cylinder against the obsidian shard ground and fired his Colt 45 directly into its core. The explosion wasn't made of fire, it was made of silence. A wave of white light expanded from the peak, washing over the desert, the canyons, and the frightened towns. As the light passed, the ghosts of the skyscrapers vanished, the radio telescopes dissolved, the neon signs flickered out. The archive was being pulled back. The mountain was reclaiming its secrets, sensing that the authorized access had failed. Thorne felt the knowledge being ripped out of his brain, the calculus, the physics, the maps of the stars, leaving behind a hollow, aching darkness. He fell to his knees as the world snapped back into 1882. The sky was once again a dusty sunset orange. The air smelled of sage and horse sweat. The dust returns. When the dust settled, Thorne was alone on the peak. Silas Vane, Sergeant Miller, and Private Henderson were gone. There were no bodies, no graves. The timeline had corrected itself, erasing the anomalies as if they had never been drawn on the page of history. Thorne looked at his palm. The circuit board scar was gone, replaced by a simple, jagged burn from a black powder flash. He descended the mountain on foot, his horse having fled during the flash. When he reached Bitter Creek, old Pete was sitting on his porch, smoking a pipe. He looked at Thorne with a puzzled expression. "Captain, where's your men? And did you find that Vane fellow?" Thorne stopped, looking at Pete. The station master didn't remember the bullet hanging in the air. He didn't remember the blue light. The reset had been total. "They're gone, Pete," Thorne said, his voice sounding older than the hills. "Lost in the canyons. The desert, it's a big place. It hides things." Thorne walked to his horse, which was tied to the rail, and looked out at the horizon.
The world was back to being small, slow, and ignorant. But as he looked at the stars, he felt a faint, lingering itch in the back of his mind, a ghost of a number, a fragment of a formula. He knew that somewhere, deep in the red canyons, the devil's mine was still waiting. The future was still there, buried in the rock, patient and silent, waiting for the year 2025 to finally arrive. And until then, Jack Thorne would be the only man in the world who knew that every step he took was on the roof of a technological tomb.